Welcome back to When the Call Hits Home. I'm Jennifer Woosley Saylor, licensed professional clinical counselor.
And I'm Ashlee Gethner, a licensed clinical social worker. And we have a really exciting episode today. So we are going to bring on our new guest, and this is Dr. Hannah Coyt. Pretty big person to have on this show. I'm really excited to have her.
Me too. She is amazing. And we're going to talk some about the brain. And Ashlee and I discussed why it might be important to have an episode like today and discuss the brain and its working. And this is not going to be by any kind of neuroscientist, clinical, like boring textbook, but much more of like the function of the brain, the functionality of it, and why it's maybe important to kind of understand some different parts and explore maybe that kind of brain body connection.
I think it's super cool because Hannah does a great job of putting it into terms that everyone can understand.
Even me.
Yeah, right. Like me too. So when we think about the brain, we hear all these different concepts, all these different words can get really confusing, but she does such an excellent job of breaking it down. And that's why I think we're so excited to have her.
Yes, and she has PhD and has all that clinical expertise, but again, can speak it in such a way that I think is really helpful. And we'll get to discuss that more and just its impact. I'm so excited to have Hannah today with us. So again, welcome to When the Call Hits Home. And we are graced today with Dr. Hannah Coyt. If you could share with us a little bit about what kind of brings you to why the call hit home.
Thanks, Jennifer. Very excited to be here. Ashlee and Jennifer, thanks for having me. Actually got affiliated and interested in the law enforcement community when I married a Leo and been married. We've been together 16 years, married for 15, and just started noticing as a mental health provider that there's a whole culture around this community and did not ever realize that beforehand, and just fell in love with learning more about being part of the culture myself, in being married to a state trooper at the time, and just curious about certain aspects as far as why they don't seek mental health services as often and things like that. And so that led into it kind of fed into my dissertation topic. And here we are basically 5-6 years later, and pretty much exclusively working with law enforcement, some firefighters, dispatchers, mostly law enforcement though, officers, and part of PCIS, and just absolutely love serving that community. So
well, I have seen your awesome work in the community for sure. And I think especially, I'm glad that you shared that piece about your dissertation and all that research that you've done. And Ashlee and I really wanted you here to talk about a little bit of the biology of the brain and kind of understanding that. I think you give a phenomenal presentation about the brain. And so just really wanted to pick your brain about talking about the brain. So just kind of wanted to start with why it's important to have a conversation about the brain, especially if we think about, the concept of a high stress job like a first responder, and then also parenting. And we'll kind of deep into that a little bit too. But just wanted to start there with kind of why is it important to have a conversation about the brain?
sure. I think it's really interesting that in mental health, particularly, that is the organ that we are focusing on. Yet, I've been a mental health provider for 25 years, and it's only been in the last 5 to 6 years that that's been a focal point for me. And I think it's just really interesting that we don't pay a lot of attention to that all the time. We are basically dealing with symptomology and not so much with why the symptoms are there. And so the brain is an important piece of that. And when I got trained in EMDR, and I had a daughter that had hydrocephalus also, and so I got really interested in the brain early on, 23 years ago, 24 years ago. And so I always had an interest in the brain, but as far as, as it applies to mental health, when I got trained in EMDR, there's a lot of pieces of the brain around that. And you all can't see it, but I carry a squishy brain in my bag everywhere I go. I was on a
I have
plane.
mine right here at my
I
desk.
say I love the squishy brain.
Yes, that was actually, Jennifer, that was your inspiration. So many people have gotten the brain talk because you showed me that brain. I was on a plane a couple weeks ago and somebody was like talking and they were like, well, what do you do? I get really anxious on a plane. And I was like, wow, really? And so I'm talking to them and I pull out my squishy brain. I'm like, let me tell you, they were in love with it. They were like, okay, I didn't even realize we're almost to where we're going. But it's important to understand the biology of the brain, what's happening in the limbic area when trauma happens. The limbic kind of hijacks our brain, and there's not a lot of, frontal lobe activity happening. It kind of goes offline for the most part. And if we aren't careful, we get stuck in that limbic. And we get stuck we hear a lot about fight, flight, freeze. It's really
Right.
way more intricate than that.
Mm.
And essentially, we have brain states, right? And if we're not careful, when we have a traumatic event, the limbic, which is where the amygdala lives, will kick in to protect us because that's its job. And the problem is it doesn't know when it doesn't have to protect us anymore. So we want it to work in that moment, right? We want the autonomic nervous system to protect us in times when we need that. But if we don't understand what's happening sometimes and we don't, seek out help for the trauma, we get stuck in that protective mode.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can't engage with people. We can't connect with people. We can't really develop that frontal lobe part of our brain. I don't know if that was what you were looking for.
Yes,
Jennifer.
it was. And I just want to say too, I appreciate, especially as a professor that's teaching counselors and future counselors, that, it's not necessarily something that we delve into. I don't know, Ashlee, about your experience and your training. I feel like I had a class here or there that just had kind of this kind of black and white outline of the brain. And I would agree, it is something that we talk about. And I don't know, I went to school a long time ago, so I don't think brains were that different back then, but I definitely don't think that we were having as many conversations about what's happening, about neurons and what's happening within the system of the brain. And I think what you're talking, can you maybe kind of explain what the ANS is? You kind of shared about that.
Yeah, so the autonomic nervous system is, I call it your ANS for my clients. I talk about that all the time. And there's a really cool video that
Which I was hoping we could link that, because that is a great video that you shared.
Yeah.
So go ahead. I'm sorry, Hannah.
No, it's okay. It's a great video because it's really easy to understand. But your autonomic nervous system basically kind of kicks in and it protects us. So in times when we need protection, it will do that. And here's the thing, the autonomic nervous system gets dysregulated when it feels like it needs to be protective all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I went to school a long time too, Jennifer, and the most that I got that I can remember about the brain was basically kind of an outline of some of the parts of the brain. And they talked about mirror neurons all of the time. And while that's true, really the more in-depth conversation there is the regulation and the co-regulation that's happening among people. And so that is the autonomic nervous system essentially scans. If you can kind of think about a scanner, it scans everything that we are, doing. So if we're in a room with a meeting,
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So if we're in a meeting and it scans the room, it's trying to figure out, is there anything here that's not safe for me? And if so, then again, those brain states, it may fight, flight, or freeze, right? Depending on that situation. Now, that sounds great when it's working well, but when we have a faulty autonomic nervous system, because we've had a lot of traumatic experiences, it perceives everything as danger. Like I said earlier, it really can't shift and, know that you're not in danger anymore and it's okay. So it sees everything as a threat. And so it won't, even if we want to connect with people, when our autonomic nervous system is dysregulated, we can't, because it keeps us protected. So even if we want to, it will withdraw to try to promote that safety.
I feel like I see that too with clients sometimes, that feeling of like, for example, a fear, like I know I shouldn't be afraid of that. I know I'm okay. I know. And that's just not what the amygdala lives in. And again, that experience with that regulation and your AINS or your ANS, like you said, just putting you in that place, it's not necessarily a cognitive thought. Like we're
Mhm.
not thinking it. Is that making sense?
It
Yeah.
does. And that the prefrontal cortex where higher order thinking happens, even if that's kicking in and saying, you don't have to be afraid, you don't have to be afraid. The amygdala, that limit, it is the fire alarm in your brain. And so I just want you to imagine if fire alarm started going off here in one of our homes and we're trying to talk and I'm saying, Jennifer, it's really okay. Like
Mhm.
somebody's cooking and you can't hear anything else. So the frontal lobe may try to be kicking in and going, I don't know why I shouldn't be afraid. There's no reason. But the fire alarm is going to be heard over everything. It drowns everything else out. And so if it is not safe, then it is going to control everything else because it's just hard to push that idea that you are safe. It's really hard to believe that fully when that's happening.
That is a amazing example because I think you're exactly right because it's just that signal going off. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and
Yeah.
so I think we're throwing a lot of big terminology, like terms out there, right? So not everybody's going to understand exactly what we're talking about. So I'm going to ask us to take it a few steps back for 1 second, if you don't mind, and
Mhm.
just kind of explain, if you can explain, maybe even using your brain, even though people can't really see it, but like explain some of those different parts and what they do for everybody, right? And this a little bit of a non-neurosurgeon explanation of the biology of the brain.
Yes.
Because I do think, right, like we're so used to jumping into it and talking about it and hearing it, but a lot of our listeners may not be as exposed to even the
Mhm.
amygdala and the prefrontal and all of that. So if you want to give us a little bit of a rundown of each of those sections and what they do, that would be so helpful.
Absolutely. And that's a good point. I think there obviously are a lot of pieces within the brain. So we'll focus on three primary pieces that really this system has to do with. The limbic is basically composed of the amygdala and the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is where all of our memory is stored. Other places in the brain too, but kind of at the basic level, like that holds a lot of the memory. So that's why when people have trauma too, like they will say, I don't remember that. I don't remember this, or I don't remember a
Mhm.
whole week around that. And that's absolutely true because when the limbic is in panic mode, the hippocampus cannot store that memory. And in fact, Daniel Amen, he is wonderful. If anyone's interested in kind of what I'm talking about, Daniel Amen is fantastic. He's done a lot of work with brain scans. They're called SPECT scans. And they have some that actually show that people who've been through a lot of trauma, that hippocampus actually shrinks. And so
Mm.
it's not as full as it
Right.
would be if someone wasn't exposed to that all the time. So the capacity for memory and being able to remember events around the trauma, but even sometimes just where are my keys? Oh, was I supposed to pick up that child? Your brain
Right.
can't hold all of that, right? So that's kind of and we think about that being in the hindbrain, kind of at the back part of our brain, but it's not. The amygdala is down there. That area is kind of down there next to the brain stem, and the vagus nerve kind of comes off from that. But honestly, the hippocampus, if you're looking at it, it's really not right there next to it, but they all work together, and it's all in the hindbrain. And then the midbrain is kind of just the again, it does a lot more, but for what we're talking about here, if you think about that midsection there, it's just kind of the connecting piece up to that frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is really where all higher order thinking happens.
Right.
So all cognitive. So when we learn something and you've probably looked at a brain before and you see all these squiggly lines and it's supposed to be the more squiggle lines we have, the smarter we are. Those are neural pathways. And so the more that we have of that, the better we are to make decisions for the next experience that we have. And so what happens there too is when that frontal lobe goes offline, we aren't making great decisions. We're making decisions out of limbic. And then so the next experience that we have, I hear people say all the time, gosh, I should have known better because you didn't though, because it didn't connect to that frontal lobe. And that was not something that was like a synapse, which is kind of like the electricity, if you will, between neurons. It doesn't happen correctly when the amygdala is in charge. I don't know, Ashlee, if that breaks down and kind of,
Oh, Hannah, that was totally perfect to kind of explain that. And I appreciate you kind of giving these examples of, I should have known better. And again, that idea of, I know I shouldn't. When we think about knowing about the brain and brain development as a parent, because you're a parent, this can be for people that are in high stress jobs, raising kids. So can you talk a little bit about maybe what would be good as a parent to know about the development of the brain?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, and I have 7 children, so I remind myself of
I
this.
wasn't going to say it, so I'm glad you did.
Yes. I remind myself of this daily, brain development, full brain development. And so we're talking about really that higher order thinking part of our brain does not fully develop, depending on what research study you read, between 23 and 25 years old. And so, and there's a lot of other pieces kind of around that. If you have trauma, it certainly stunts that development. And so that's why you see people, I always just kind of equated that to being like, I know you all may or may not remember like the psychosocial stages where Freud, like trust versus mistrust.
What do you mean? I don't remember that. I lived in that for years.
How can you not, right? But it's really about brain development. And so that's why people get stuck in those stages, is because the development doesn't happen the way that it needs to. And they get stuck in that. And so you'll have someone who's 35 and you're looking at them like, that's something a 17-year-old would do. Like, what are you doing? And it's because that development has gotten stunted somewhere along the trauma line there. And honestly, most people that don't even report that they have trauma, when you start digging in a little bit around that time, you're like, oh, yep, that's exactly what's happening. So for parents, understanding that when you ask them, what were you thinking? They probably were not, because that part of the brain is not completely developed. Now, that's not to say that we don't promote that and want them to do different things and try to, my kid's favorite word, teaching moments. But they aren't going to, even if they cognitively know it, like they may know what you've told them, but they're not able to reason like we are when our brain is fully developed. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that definitely answers the question. And I think it's, sometimes parenting, it's about, expectation. And again, what's the beautiful Albert Einstein quote? Like, if you expect a fish to climb a tree, I think sometimes having some expectation that maybe, hey, that's not where our kids developed at. That doesn't mean that we don't have expectations for our kids, but understanding some of the development, especially with their brain, is helpful.
Well, I think it was important for us to all talk about that, because I know in some other episodes prior to this one, something Jennifer and I have talked about in terms of being a child of a first responder is this notion of wanting us to do more, even as kids, right? I call them unrealistic expectations. Everyone's going to be like, Ashlee, we're so sick of hearing it. But that's how I feel, right? Like, they kind of hold us to a very high standard as kids, or that's how it was for me as my experience as a child of a first responder. But I think that's so important for anyone listening to recognize that sometimes as kids, we just actually don't have that capacity quite yet.
I agree with that. And that's definitely an experience that I had as well, that there were some standards that maybe weren't really matching where I was at developmentally. And I'll share a little bit from an experience working with a family, and a parent had an expectation for a kiddo to be grateful for something. And this kid, it just was not in their development timeline to really understand gratitude. And this adult was wanting just gratitude to just show up in this kiddo, their kid, and they had a lot of things to be grateful for. That wasn't untrue. It just like, that's just not going to be induced by a child at that age. And that doesn't mean that we don't coach it, encourage it, all those things. But as an adult, if you're having that expectation for a kiddo, you're going to be being pretty disappointed.
Well, and Jennifer, that's a good point because honestly, that is in frontal lobe. Gratitude and moral, the moral compass, morality and empathy and all those things, they are in the frontal lobe. They are not located in limbic. So that's an excellent point that they're not going to have that. Again, it's not that we don't want to encourage it, but it's not developed yet. And so when we are expecting that and the higher expectations that we have, the more room for disappointment, right? For the kid to then it stunts that development because then they have this self-loathing situation. And that's where they get stuck. The Erickson stages that I was talking about earlier, the psychosocial stages, that's where that kind of comes in. They get stuck in that not being able to trust themselves and not feeling like they can trust people around them and not feeling like they are having this inferiority around that. That's all brain stuff. That's all brain stuff.
Well, and I've always joked, and I've said this with parents, and I probably will have my own karma of this, but I was in my 20s when I finally went to my parents and was like, thank you for teaching me to load a dishwasher. Like I was working in a group home and working with adolescents, and like they just didn't have the concept of that. And it's something I totally took for granted. Like, oh, wow, like I'm really appreciative. Again, I was in my 20s when at that realization, I mean, I'm sure my parents wish that happened a lot sooner for me, but it did come around eventually. So,
yeah.
Well, and I think you made a great point too, to that, the extent of which, like, I think parents can also get frustrated really easily at their children. But if they know these things, and like you said, you have to remind yourself of that daily, it's something that I think is really helpful for them. But as we talk about what it's like for parents and children and their brain development, how can this also be impacted by high stress jobs such as first responders?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Ashlee. I was just thinking that when you marry a child that doesn't have that brain development yet, and a first responder that's working in a high stress job and that part of the brain is offline, it is a recipe for disaster many, many times because, that first responder doesn't realize that they're kind of acting out of limbic too. They've gone on call after call after call after call, right? And so when they come home, it's not just, okay, you're home, so we don't have to do that anymore. I know my own kids, they didn't tell him, but they would kind of like come to me and be like, Mom, like we aren't suspects. We're not, and I'm like, you're absolutely right. And my husband didn't mean for them to feel that way, but it was just more of he was in limbic, they were still in limbic, and those two things showing up at the same table, that's probably going to be a high conflict situation. And so I would have to remind them, Dad needs some downtime, and I would have to remind Dad, like their brain's not fully developed. And I can promise you this situation's probably not going to go well. And so I don't know how a lot of spouses feel, but being a mental health provider, I felt like I was mediating a lot, early on. And then, until my husband kind of figured that out and got that education and about what was happening. And we had to do some things like, what do you need when you come home? Like, do you need to take off the uniform and get a shower? Do you need to go up to your chair and sit for 45 minutes and decompress? But there's got to be a switch off. You can't come in high gear, right, and expect to engage because your brain's not ready to engage. Your brain is still ready to fight, flight, or, completely free, like the dorsal piece. And so the other piece to that, and I hear spouses talk about that too, is that they may not come in that way, but they may come in completely disengaged.
Right.
And so, and kids also really kind of take that on as well. Like, what's wrong? Like, why isn't my parent engaging with me? And what did I do? Are they mad? That kind of thing. And those pieces, even though we don't think about it, because they're developing, their brain is developing, that kind of connects for them that maybe there's something, again, it goes back to that, what did I do wrong? Why am I not good enough? Or, I mean, it shows up different for everybody, but those things are prominent.
Oh, absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing that. And I think as much as like the brain's not developed in our kiddos, it is developing, right? And it's paying attention to what's around it and noticing. And you're exactly right. If we come in kind of not in a regulated state, no matter what it is, our kid's going to pick up on that. They really are sponges. And so I think it's great to hear of like, hey, what do you need in a part of a transition? And I guess to kind of talk a little bit, because I think solutions are awesome, or, looking at things from a lens of like what can be done. Do you have kind of what are some healthy practices to kind of help with some of this function? Like, I think what you kind of said you do in your own family is helpful, but anything else that you think would be helpful for people to know?
Well, I really am a fan, as you all know, of trauma-informed treatment. And I feel like, EMDR is kind of my preference, but also I marry that a lot with polyvagal, the polyvagal theory. And what I like about polyvagal is that there's a lot of practices that folks can learn and do on their own. And so they can do them in between sessions, whereas EMDR, that's not so much the case. You've got to be, in the room. But there's a book, and let me see if I carry a brain and this book, so you know that I'm totally a nerd, but it's Polyvagal Exercises for Safety and Connection. And it was written by Deb Dana. And so one of the things that I use with a lot of my first responders is we will kind of go through and pick some of these, and like ones that I will do with them first in the office, but ones that they practice and they love it. And they come back and they taught their kids. I had a firefighter that I did some of this work with, and he was just having a real high, like a volatile relationship with his preteen. I think he was 12. We all know how fun that can be. And so he got regulated, and then he started, instead of like being upset and getting activated, he was feeling that in himself. And then he was teaching his kids. So he'd come back, and actually he's been discharged. He's done really well. But before we ended, he was teaching his wife, he was teaching his kids, all of these regulating activities. And I was like, that is amazing, because that's kind of what we have to do. And I also think it helps if the parents are able to not just tell the kids to do it, because that's what we do. Let's do timeout. Let's breathe. But let's do that together. Let's do that together, because I might be a little out of sorts too. So let's breathe together. And it makes them feel like there's that connection piece. And again, we're promoting co-regulation. We're promoting that positive brain development. And it's honestly, in my opinion, the best way to do it. And I also feel like in counseling, it shouldn't be just the kid that you're sending to counseling. Right. What can we do as a family, like as a unit? It's systemic, right? And so having that conversation around what is it that I can do? How can we sit through this? And I've literally had parents with kids sitting in my office, first responders and their kids, and just they're doing some of these breathing exercises, or they're doing, and it becomes their thing. It's really cool. It's really cool.
It's incredible. And I think you're right in terms of making that a family, because what a lesson to have for our kids, and what a gift really is the development comes along. I think that's beautiful.
And the connection that I think can be made by just doing that with your children, right? Like it opens doors maybe to even more conversation and things like that happening. I think it grows a deeper connection if you're willing to show them that you're also putting in the effort and wanting to figure it out together. I really like that idea.
I will also say, and I know we're probably coming to the end of our time here, but I will also say that another really good way to regulate is nature. And so if you can just take a walk with your kids, get the dog, or if you don't have a dog, just walk on your own. Go outside. What do you notice over here? What do you notice over here? My kids don't always want to go outside. We are in a culture right now where devices, phones and computers and games and all that kind of thing is the thing, but that's really not great for our brain. And that's a whole nother podcast, but it's really not great for our brain at all. And so nature is phenomenal. And again, what Ashlee just said, if we're doing it together, it's a bonding piece that's happening. We're regulating our own nervous systems, and we're together, so we're co-regulating. And even if it's just walking down by a lake, we have a little man-made lake at one of the parks here where I live, and they have ducks that are really mean. But my kids love going down there, and we all go down there and we laugh because the ducks usually chase one or more of my kids. But that's been a huge, like my kids, when they talk about things that they enjoy, like what was great about this week, it's almost always that it's not really even something that cost anything, right? It's just
Aw.
being there. So I think that's another important piece to think about.
I think that's beautiful. I thought you were going to say buy a horse, but yeah, that's
Yeah.
good
Oh,
too.
yeah, that one too.
So, we were just kind of talking a little bit, just to wrap us up here in a second. But again, that idea of healthy practices and the function of the brain. And we were kind of just talking a little bit about every kind of family has a different way and a different kind of priorities and different kind of things. Is there anything that you kind of encourage to kind of explore that? And again, this kind of idea of regulation and
Yeah, I think I understand the question. It's more of, I kind of start with, again, what have you done already? Usually there's at least one or two things that, well, we really get along when we're doing this or that. And so I'll go off of that and say, well, I wonder what's happening there. Do you remember what it feels like in your body when you're in that? And of course, that's some people's least favorite question because we want to disconnect. We want to disassociate. That's another thing that we often do when the amygdala is screaming at us all day, like we've got to turn the fire alarm off. So we disassociate. It's not on purpose, right? It just, our brain can only handle so much before it just disengages. And so I'll say, like, what were you feeling in your body? What did you notice? And if that's a good practice, like, can we do more of that? So a lot of times, again, people get out more in the summertime, obviously, with family. You've got breaks and things like that. But what about in times that it's winter or you can't get out? Like, what do you all do? Is there something you do in the house? My family loves board games. I do not love board games. Okay. Just throwing that out there. But they love board games and they're regulated and so I will sit and then I will have my 18-year-old and my husband tell me how to move because when it gets to be my turn, I have no idea what I'm doing in those board games because they're real elaborate board games that they love. But it's more about the connection piece. And so I think, and I hope that I answered your question, Jennifer, but I think when it comes to that, asking them to think about a time that they did feel connected and that it didn't feel difficult or it didn't feel rushed or, their body really felt regulated. And probably the best description of that I've ever heard is, I don't really feel anything right now. I'm like, I don't feel that, like my heart's not right. Like I can breathe. And they sometimes think there's something wrong because they've never been fully regulated, right? So I will ask them to think about like what time brought that or brought as close to that as possible. And how can we build on that?
That was beautifully said, and I didn't give you the
so
best
good.
handoff as a question, so I appreciate you really taking that torch and explaining it beautifully. And I think that's right. A place to start is just like, what is going well? What is working for us? Where are we laughing and playing? And that it doesn't have to be this big mindful thing of, I need to make a list on how I'm going to regulate with my family, and it's going to be our priority. It is just looking for those moments that we're finding some joy. And I really appreciate you talking about when we really detach from ourselves, that sometimes it's just easier to just shut it all off. And really what this ultimately is about is just kind of being a whole person, right? Like that our brain is online with our body. And that we model that for our families and for our kiddos and all of those things. So that was a beautiful way to answer that question that I've flubbed for you.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that she's going to have to come back on.
I agree.
We're going to have to do more of this because I think we just kind of, we're only on the surface right now. I think there's a lot more that can be said, right?
There's a lot more. Just get me started talking about the vagus nerve, and that's a whole nother. Yeah.
I wrote a whole list while we've been talking, so don't worry, everybody. Dr. Coyt will be back. There's several episodes coming, Well, thank you for coming on and giving us your time and your knowledge. It really is unmatched. You are incredible, and we are blessed to have you on here.
And I just think I appreciate, Hannah, your ability to kind of share your knowledge and information. And again, you're a parent of 7 kids, you work or are in a first responder family, and just having all this information. I appreciate you even sharing your own experiences. That takes a lot of courage. So thank you for that, Hannah. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you guys for having me on. I feel very honored to be on this podcast. I'm excited about it.
Very VIP. We don't just let anybody on
Yeah.
here.
All righty. Well, we will talk to you later. What a special episode. I mean, she did incredible. I think I'm still blown away right now.
She is amazing. And I think, again, just kind of speaking to all those things so beautifully and in such a way that, I don't know, that's, I think, so understandable and practical as a parent as well. It's amazing.
And she really, well, all of us together, right? We do plan to have more deep discussions about these, about the brain and things. Yep.
Well, we just hit like the tip of the iceberg. I think there's so much. I feel like each one of the things that she was kind of sharing is like, oh, and we could talk about this, and we could talk about this, and we could talk about this. It's all part of it for sure. So we are just really getting started on this, the biology of the brain and kind of understanding
how it impacts our first responders and us as children of first responders. And I think it's kind of endless information that we all need. What we do want to say, though, is that all the resources she has talked about within the episode will be available to you guys via probably our social medias and our website, though. So on our website, it's really important that you go on there. There is a resource tab.
Yes.
So anytime you maybe don't see it on our socials, please go to our website, hit that resource tab, and the information is going to be there for you. So whatever she said today, we will make sure to get that up and loaded for all of you to see.
Absolutely.
If you need it.
And I saw that video that she shared for the first time, and it was so helpful. And I pass it on to a lot of my clients. So please, check that out for sure. And our website will always be linked through our social media. So if that's where you start, you'll always be able to find that in our resource page on our site.
Awesome. Well, this was a wrap up of episode 5 already, which is kind of insane to think about, but the love and support,
wild.
I know, has been endless, and it is quite amazing. We're so thankful to be on this journey, and we just want you guys to always remember that when the call hits home, Jennifer and I are going to be here for you.
Thank you.